Hi, I'm Josh Rushing, filling in for the irreplaceable Femi, okay? China is fighting what its government calls a people's war against the deadly coronavirus. But it's also battling to diffuse public anger over its handling of the crisis. Is China putting party before the people? Send your thoughts through Twitter and YouTube, and you too could be in the stream. The coronavirus spreading across China has now taken 1,800 lives. But as cases mount, Chinese authorities are scrambling to address criticism that they should have been more open about the crisis. On Saturday, the Chinese government took the rare step of revealing that President Xi Jinping led a meeting about the virus with the highest members of the Communist Party on January 7th. It shows that Xi was aware of the virus sweeping Wuhan nearly 2 weeks before he publicly acknowledged it. Earlier this month, thousands of people took to Chinese social media to mourn Dr. Li Wenliang, who died from the virus. Li was reprimanded by police in January for spreading so-called rumors about the emerging outbreak in Hubei province. Yet those social media posts, many with the hashtag "We want freedom of speech," were wiped by government censors. For more on how China is mediating this unprecedented health crisis, we are joined from New York by William Young. He's a journalist who covers the Greater China region. Also in New York, we have Yachu Wong. She's a China researcher at Human Rights Watch. And from Edinburgh, we are joined by Maria Repnikova. She's a scholar of Chinese political communications and is an assistant professor at Georgia State University. Hello, everyone. I want to begin by talking to you, William. Catch us up. Over the weekend, it seems to me that pressure is starting to mount in the international press, with the criticism being pointed more specifically at President Xi. Is that a fair assessment? And if so, do you think he's starting to feel the heat?
Yeah, so basically, I think the revelation of the speech kind of like confirm what a lot of the experts in China are already talking about, which is the fact that the central government has long known about the situation locally in Wuhan. But what they did not do is to immediately step in and really take over and really make sure that the situation is not going out of control. Instead, they let the local government and also medical experts in the beginning to kind of like downplay the seriousness of the whole outbreak, while they insist on continuing with a lot of the very risky situations, like inviting 40,000 families in Wuhan itself to gather over right before Chinese New Year, when the virus was already spreading among people to people. So I think that just shows that it's basically a very serious challenge to Xi Jinping's image as a very strong leader, as what he wanted to do when he openly talked about it and addressed the government and the local, the whole nation to like immediately set it as the top priority.
And Yachu, when you look at the situation, what's the mood of the Chinese people at this point?
I mean, I follow Chinese social media, both WeChat and Weibo, and people are obviously very angry. I mean, despite the censorship, there's still a lot of posts, people expressing their outrage, and also as well as their sadness over the situation and the fear over their health and their family's health.
Yachu, I was looking at something that put this into context, saying that this might be one of the top 3 greatest challenges that the Chinese Communist Party has faced, putting it in the same tier as Tiananmen Square and the Cultural Revolution. Does that seem accurate or fair from your perspective?
I think, definitely it's the biggest challenge since Xi Jinping came to power. I mean, just by observing the anger on the internet. But I would say, there are waves of outrage after disasters and emergency. The SARS in 2003, the Wenzhou train crash in 2011, the Tianjin explosion in 2015. So I've observed the waves of anger. So every time the government, responded with more censorship and more repression. So the government has been, been able to successfully suppress public anger.
Talk about the suppression and the censorship. Maria, you've written in the New York Times an op-ed piece that there actually is some reporting, some good reporting, coming out from local outlets in Wuhan. Can you expand on that a little bit?
It wasn't so much local outlets. It was actually national media that reported in really professional manner on the crisis, including media such as Caixin magazine out of Beijing. Caixin is also based in Beijing, a number of Beijing-based, but also media based in Guangzhou and other cities. In Wuhan itself, it was more civic activists or social media activists who were reporting from within. They were filming, and some of them have already disappeared, but the media itself has persisted for quite some time. There was a window of opening for investigative journalism that revealed the cover-ups at the local level at every step of the way. One of the most impressive reports was done by Caixin magazine, and some of these reports have remained uncensored. So the media control, it's not completely uniform. Some things disappear, immediately. Some things remain online. It's kind of a ad hoc, improvised manner of restrictions, and I think it's not completely a blanket, form of censorship.
Maria, you mentioned that before the window closed. What do you mean by the window, and how does one know when it's opened or closed?
The window is a space or an opportunity to report on events in a more critical manner. So Yato just mentioned this notion of, crisis management in China. We've seen crises, appear over and over, and there are several tactics that the state takes as the crisis take place. One of them is, of course, censorship. But at the beginning, when everything is in turmoil, when it's not quite clear what's taking place, there's usually an opportunity or kind of a space of a few days to a week, sometimes it's a couple of weeks, when journalists can report on the events in a more objective, sometimes more in-depth and critical manner. And this practice of critical journalism has evolved in China over decades. It's not a new thing. Even though Western media tends to focus only on censorship, we actually see some really talented, brave and professional reporters in China that have survived restrictions and have taken advantage of these really rare spaces for critical coverage.
But Maria, the fact that you're identifying that there's a window when they can report and when they can't, isn't that kind of reaffirming the fact that the government is in control of the narrative and that there is suppression and censorship of free expression, even though, as I understand it, free expression is guaranteed by the Chinese Constitution?
Well, the fact that there is a window means that the spaces are fragile. It's not a window that lasts forever. They're perhaps, as I said, days or a week, but then afterwards, the state starts to take over the narrative. So the current narrative is more on positive sentiment, celebrating the heroes of the crisis and everybody who's doing good to support the national effort of beating this disease. But it doesn't mean that there are no multiple voices. Just as Yato just mentioned, even currently in social media sphere, there are still people criticizing various aspects of governance during this crisis. So the China is full of contradictions. There isn't just this one, multidimensional control. There are also various voices that manage to speak through those loopholes, and they continue to do so to this day.
The fact they have to find loopholes, though, sounds like confirmation of the idea to me. I'm sorry, you guys were going to jump in. Go for it, William.
Yeah, so I think I want to add it, just raise two very prime examples of people who are actually taking the advantage in the very beginning when the government hasn't really imposed the censorship yet. So Chen Choushi, and also he's one of the most active poster and citizen journalists that went into Wuhan and sharing a daily videos and also posts and YouTube live about what's actually happening in Wuhan. And in the very beginning, the whole world is actually relying on what he's actually sharing with the world to know what's exactly happening in Wuhan. But later, when the government is starting to take in control of the narrative, he was forced into disappearance. And there's another guy whose name is Fang Bing, and then also he famously shared another video that's showing that actually dead body were being managed in a very just not medically correct way. And then that was also allowing people to see how the local government is being overwhelmed by the situation. And then later on, he was also disappeared. I was actually supposed to interview him on the day that he went disappeared. So that just shows that when the government is starting to step in terms of controlling the narrative, these critical voices would then be silenced in a very oppressed way.
Yeah, but they're silenced also, in a way that's not complete, right? So some of them are silenced and disappear, others continue to publish. So there's this incoherent kind of control, but we do see the most radical voices that are very popular online. The more popular you are, the more likely you are to disappear. So there's kind of a tendency to silence those that are most outspoken or vocal or popular.
I feel, that this window is actually a tool by the Chinese government to, as a way to gather information. So when something, this is not just happened to this episodes. It happened during Tianjin explosion. You see, there's a window there, critical reporting, and it's done by local journalists, who did a fantastic job. But it is also a way for the Chinese government to gather information from the public, see, what's going on the ground and how angry people are.
I want to.
Absolutely. is known for responsive authoritarianism, which means responding to public concerns while controlling public opinion. So that makes sense.
Follow on the back on this, and we can take a look at my laptop here. I read this opinion piece from Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times this weekend called "I Cannot Remain Silent," and it's referring to a scholar who's written an essay that's gone viral across China called "The Viral Alarm: When Fury Overcomes Fear." And in this essay, he writes, I'm going to scroll down to it if I can find it, that this is probably the last thing I'll be able to write. And shortly after that, I can't find it here, but shortly after that, he was made incommunicado. He's now been cut off from all communications. But we're going to post this so people can see it. If you check out my Twitter feed, you can actually find a link to this essay that they don't want you to see. But it's not just journalists or citizen journalists who have disappeared. Now we're starting to silence scholars on this. As a scholar, Maria, what's the message you take away from that?
Well, silencing scholars has also taken place for quite some time. Mm-hmm. When a scholar becomes, again, very visible online, he or she turns into an activist as well. So scholars in China are very known for participating in social movements, both subtle and less subtle. So I think once one becomes, a visible scholar, somebody who's actually speaking on behalf of the public, but also raising such sensitive issues as freedom of speech, you shift into a category that's sensitive, and as a result may face reprimands that you wouldn't otherwise face if you're quietly living your days as an academic in a university.
Yeah, I was reading somewhere. Oh, sorry, Maria, I thought you were done there.
Yeah.
I was reading somewhere that something like 1 out of 10 people on this planet are under quarantine right now, like 10% of the planet's population. 700 and something million people are under quarantine. I'm looking at you, Yaqiu. What could China have done differently in this? If this outbreak would have started in Manhattan or in LA, would the U.S. have responded any better, perhaps?
I certainly hope so. I mean, something that I would say it is like kind of authoritarian impulses to hit information at the very beginning. So I would, hopefully expect if it happened in the U.S., the local government would be more transparent and would disclose the information, accurately. So I think that is the first aspect. I think, right now I'm following social media. I saw a lot of videos of people are literally like tied up because they fail to wear masks when they go out. So there are a lot of human rights violations and just government actions that, it's very, it's not respecting people's dignity. So, I would expect if it happened in democratic countries, they're done a little bit better, respecting people's basic dignity.
I want to bring in Twitter here. This is a tweet from Femi last week, bringing up the issue, and then as I scrolled down, I found this tweet where someone put up this graphic about how freedom of speech has impacted the spread of this crisis. William, I'm curious from your perspective, how has the lockdown on information affected the ability for people to respond to the virus?
Yeah, so I think if we actually look at the progression of this whole event, in the very beginning when there's a very controlled way of the government notifying people, the whole city of Wuhan, about the actual nature of the virus. They were telling them that it's curable and controllable, so people have less awareness about what they need to do. And then when things are starting to go out of control, the government, like we see it, there was a period of time when they didn't know what to say or what to do. So the citizen journalists jump in and then start filling in the actual picture of what's happening, and then people suddenly raise their awareness to the highest level, and then we saw panicking in Wuhan itself, that all the resources, daily products at groceries disappeared within the day. But and then then the government jumped in again. Then we saw that the information started to be very coordinated in a way that the government want the public to know. So in terms of that, the freedom of expression in this particular crisis plays a very significant role in the stages that people were being informed. And also other experts were saying how the power of internet is actually making a big difference in terms of making this a lot more complex complicated situation for the Chinese government to control and deal with comparing to, let's say, the June 4th or even the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, everyone didn't have a cell phone back then, right? And so it makes it so much harder to control the information. We went to the Chinese government and asked for comment, or I guess we did not get an affirmative response on that. So we do want to bring in a bite here from President Xi himself, because as the virus continues to sweep across China, I think people have been looking to the central government, and especially the president, for action. Here's what President Xi Jinping said in late January as he met with the head of the World Health Organization.
The Chinese people are now in a serious battle against the epidemic. The Chinese government attaches great importance to this because the purpose of the government is to put the lives and health of the people at the top of all priorities. Therefore, I have been personally directing and deploying the epidemic prevention and containment work this time. I believe that as long as we strengthen our confidence, help each other, adopt scientific prevention and containment measures, and persist in precise policies, we will definitely win the battle against the outbreak.
So there's President Xi saying that he's personally in charge of this. But if he's personally in charge, why is it only officials at the lower levels seem to be getting fired? William, what do you think?
This goes back to the very typical way that the CCP has always been handling a crisis like this, is that they need to make sure that the highest level officials are not going to be considered as like losing control over the society. So in Chinese, we call it 维稳, and then in English, we translate it into maintaining stability. So maintaining stability is always going to be the top priority for the Chinese Communist Party at the very top level, no matter what. So they'd rather sacrifice those at the bottom to make them look incompetent, whereas the central government will then jump in, and then in the end, they can always shape the narrative into something as if, this is a triumph for the socialism that China has been championing and promoting over the last 70 years.
I want to bring in Joshua Wong here. He's a democracy activist and leader of the protest in Hong Kong, and we have a community sought from him. Can we play that now?
With the outbreak of coronavirus in Hong Kong, it's just imply how the government can't solve the crisis and its lack of capacity to governance Hong Kong with stability, especially when the government is not elected by people, and with the shortage of surgical masks, people line up in the midnight just because asking for masks and enough tissues, which is really hard to imagine in such well-developed city. So I think with such uncertainty, it explains why the reason we need to fight for democracy. We need a government that is elected by people instead of just serving the interests of Beijing.
Yeah, I want to show you something on Twitter here. That's on my laptop. I'm going to turn the sound on. This is reported to be tens of thousands of people who've gone out to their porches in Wuhan and are screaming. And they're yelling, Wuhan, add oil, which means keep the fighting up, keep it pumped up. And if you go down and look at the comments, this actually reminds me a lot in Chile, under the Pinochet regime, they had what called cacerolas, where people went out and banged pans. It's a way of expressing kind of solidarity when you can't get to the street or it's not safe to get to the street. If you look at the comments below, yes, we hear you. You are not alone. You shout out the same all around the globe. Wuhan, add oil. Your government has failed you, but we are with you. Will this have lasting consequences on the government in China? Who wants to jump in on that?
I think it's a little too early to say what sort of consequences this will bring, because as we watch over the years, when this crisis occurred, at the beginning, there's this almost hopeful narrative in Western media that something might happen. And as you just played this Hong Kong activist, voice that, we should fight for democracy. But this is a Hong Kong perspective. And Dialogue could also mean just solidarity to fight the crisis. It doesn't mean fight the government. So that's one thing. And second thing is that Xi Jinping could take mass opportunity to kind of showcase the strength, the capacity of the Chinese Party state to beat this massive epidemic. Because again, going back to comparisons, we don't really have comparisons at the moment with the US. We don't have something comparable that has happened in the West recently. So it's hard to say how another government would have handled it. But if they handle it well enough, say the epidemic disappears in a month or a few months, and they play it as a victory, this could actually play into the strength of the party state. So I think for now, saying that this is a massive failure of the whole system is way too early.
I totally agree. I think, I'm worried about the state the government has become even more repressive after this episode, because right now they've been implementing a lot of restrictions on people's movement, on people's speech. I mean, it's likely that they will not lift those things. I mean, it only helps them to hone repression skills through this emergency.
William, what do you think? Will this have a lasting effect? How will this change China?
I think I have to agree with both Maria and Yachou over here. Actually, in fact, Yachou, in an interview that she did with me just a couple of weeks ago, when right after Dr. Li Wenliang died, she did touched on the fact that how the Chinese government has been very successful in terms of controlling and then using censorship as a very powerful tool to ensure that everything will ended up still under their control. And Xi Jinping, in particular, has been very good at using technology as a way to monitor and surveil people. And right now, he has been imposing and implementing all these so-called wartime measures throughout Wuhan and Hubei province, and it's actually expanding to other parts of China, which means that people's basic movement and freedom of movement is completely out of their hand, and everything is now being monitored and controlled by the government. So when that happens, I just think that it's very unlikely for people to be able to have a very coordinated way to kind of like put up a very I guess, like fight against the government or the system that they consider as failing them.
That kind of control, does it make your job at Amnesty International? How does it affect your job at Amnesty International, Yachou?
Hi, first of all, I work for Human Rights Watch, but
Human
I
Rights
love
Watch. I'm sorry, you're right.
I love Amnesty too. I mean, we have always had difficulties in accessing China, but we try our best. I mean, of course, I talk to people through secure channels, and when people come out of China, we try to have communication with them to teach them how to, best protect themselves, and they bring those skills back to China. It has been difficult, and it's getting increasingly difficult.
And Maria, what do you see in terms of political communication? How has the revolution of smartphones, and everyone has them now, affected the government's communication strategies?
Well, I think the evolution of smartphones has affected the dynamics of political communication. So on the one hand, we see this epidemic as the first one being truly televised by people themselves, from doctors to patients to common residents. We really have this kind of sense of co-participating in this crisis. Everybody's watching it, which puts up a lot of pressure on authorities to perform, of course, but it also can accentuate the performance itself. Over the years, the government has really perfected the performance. There's been all kinds of new apps, new strategies to develop to kind of attract people into this various official communication orbits, all sorts of games and messages and all kinds of propaganda techniques. So smartphones and new media have both, accelerated the interaction between state and society, but they also empower both the societal actors to be more creative, but also the state to be more powerful in propagating its narrative. So we're now seeing these tensions in real life, which is why this case is extremely fascinating.
Is it also a little bit unfair to put so much criticism on China when they've really alone had to bear the brunt of this so far? Looking at the press now, I think we might be at a turning point where the Chinese chapter of the coronavirus might be wrapping up, and we're looking at this being a worldwide virus. Will it take some of the pressure off of China when the virus is spreading in other countries, William?
I don't think so, because people will always look back to where it came from. And then there are, in fact, some very worrying signs that this epidemic has already been associated in the very I would say the very racially discriminative way to some people, Chinese descent or even Asian descent in different parts of the world. They're facing challenges and difficulties of being labeled as, the group of people that are spreading this virus right now. Just here in New York, I was just having lunch with a friend who was reporting about how the Chinatown business has been decreasing by a couple percent just since the outbreak started a month ago. So that just shows how much people are sometimes associating the outbreak with in a very more.
Hey, William, I need to wrap it there. I got to thank you, though, for joining us, and thank all our guests for joining us. That's all for today. But keep sending your thoughts and comments through Twitter, YouTube, aljazeera.com/the stream. Bye for now.